Stefano, if you could just be rather brief, because we're getting close to the lunch hour, and I wanted to be able to throw a couple of questions in. So Stefano Ledda is going to give us some brief perspective from his side of things as an entrepreneur.
Hello, everyone. Before entering the specific topic of the panel, if you think of the human history, most of the atrocities have been committed by people who were absolutely certain that they had the truth. Okay, so maybe having a post-truth system where, going back to what Michael was saying yesterday, everyone chooses which newspaper to read to hear his truth. I think that's an intermediate step, and the ultimate goal is actually to be able, as individuals, to listen to different types of truths and then get our own perception of it, which will be unique and individual. I'm always concerned of authorities. Okay, I'm an independent person. I used to be in the military, but that didn't go very well. I like people to think with their own mind, you know. And generally speaking, if the majority thinks something, I'm going to have a natural sympathy towards the minority. That's just how my DNA is. So maybe post-truth is not such a bad thing after all, and that's where we need to get to. Now, going back to the topic of our panel, whether it's self-regulation by the companies or the governments should set the tone and the framework and everything. So yesterday, I don't remember who of the presenters was saying, can you trust Facebook to self-regulate? Obviously not. Okay, I think it's fairly obvious. Can you trust governments to regulate what Facebook does? I would say also, obviously not. They don't have the technical expertise for one. They're going to be forced to go back to Facebook. So I'm when I'm not traveling and enjoying life, I'm a deal maker. Okay, I help people. I sit out of the schemes. I'm really an independent advisor and consultant, which doesn't mean much. Everyone's an advisor and a consultant. But what I do is I like to study and observe trends. And then I help people. I try to identify what the objectives are, what the landing points are going to be. And then I try to help people to get there. And that's essentially what I do. So I'm used to having a different perspective on things. But as a deal maker, I can say that if you have a situation where, so companies are driven by profit, right? Companies are driven by profit. Anyone who says otherwise has a different agenda. Truth is not on it. So companies are driven by profit. Governments are driven by what? By approval, right? Consensus. The first objective of any government at its first mandate is to get a second mandate. Okay, companies' profits, governments' approval. Now, the interesting thing here is that these two players, the companies can influence the approval, right? Because Facebook or other platforms can decide effectively what people are spoon-fed and what people will believe. So the companies can influence the approval. The governments, of course, can influence the profits, because all they need to do is smack a tax and profits are dented immediately, right? Now, in my experience, what is going to happen in this situation? They're going to shake hands. They're going to make a deal, okay, in their own interest, so approvals and profits. So are we doomed? Actually, no, I think no. I think that there is a way to put pressure on these two players. Profits will still be coming ultimately from people, even if mediated through advertising, right? And in the end, approvals also come from people, emanate from votes, consent. So the pressure is going to be on the people to force these two players to actually find a solution that is not going to be just window dressing, at which they're very good at, and at which self-regulation works perfectly. For window dressing, it's amazing. But if we want to see real change, the pressure is going to have to come from the bottom. And if you look, I have an example to make, which, you know, there's this 16-year-old Swedish girl, which no one knew a couple of years back, maybe 1 year back. Okay, this girl has done more for environmentalism than, unfortunately, scores of scientists over decades. in terms of general knowledge that there is a problem. Okay, I think it's pretty obvious that Greta Thunberg has done more for environmentalism than everyone else put together, because everyone knows who she is, everyone listens to her. She has this impact. That is the beauty of these modern times, that everyone is empowered. It comes with risks, of course. But to wrap it up, and I keep my word to be brief, if there is going to be, if there are two players who have an interest in making a deal, they're going to make a deal. But luckily, in these times, everyone has access to information. Everyone can make his voice be heard. And so if people keep the pressure on the governments then, and the companies, because also boycotts, it's not just voting for the other party, it's also boycotting a certain company or product that works very effectively in some cases, then we're going to have a regulation that can work. Okay? In terms of business opportunities, of course, you're going to have a lot of them. Business opportunities are going to be helping the government, helping the companies, of course, as in the traditional model. But I think there's a very nice niche for independent fact checkers. We've already seen them come around. Of course, who's going to check the controllers? That's a whole other subject. But I think that is going to be an interesting area. So basically, helping the people channel their control over the two players to prevent them from a window dressing deal. And that's it.
Great. All right, Stefano, thank you for keeping it brief. Yeah, we're right on 1 o'clock, which is lunchtime, and there's the Young People Summit at 2 o'clock. So I don't want to be too long here, but maybe just for the purposes of having a little tiny bit of dialogue, and unfortunately the Slido's not working. I can't seem to see any new questions. I'm just going to therefore throw two very, very quick questions. I'm asking you guys to be quick here, but specifically to Tom and Chiara, because there's an interesting potential conflict in the perspectives that you're both bringing there, where Tom's looking at this need for privacy. Joe, sorry, I was calling you Tom. Sorry, Joe. Joe's looking at this right to privacy, and you sort of have this fundamental right, not quite absolute. But Chiara, you're trying to catch criminals, and you laid out this very long process that it takes for you to get information. And you therefore have an interest in perhaps decrypting data and getting access to that to protect us from these criminals. How do we resolve this conflict? Where does it lie? And it's ultimately, I suppose, Joe, what your job actually is. But if the two of you can just dig a little deeper into that, it'd be good.
Well, yes, perhaps I should start out by admitting that a lot of my day job is actually working with the police and the intelligence services to help them do exactly that which Chiara was doing. Yeah. And I should also admit to being one of the authors of the Cybercrime Convention that she was referring to. And the reason is quite simple. I mean, I think that there is a false dichotomy. And the false dichotomy is security versus privacy, right? I believe very strongly in security and privacy. And my job, both as a lawyer and as a techie, is to try and make the two go together. It's perfectly possible to make the two go together. It's just that you have to be more proactive about it. I'll give you a few examples. One, if I am saying I believe in encryption and the right to encryption, but I likewise believe in the right to Chiara, for example, being able, with a warrant, place malware on a phone. Because if she doesn't have the right to place malware on a phone, then how on earth am I going to help her do her job? But the key thing here is that Chiara wouldn't be able to do it without constraints. So when I was talking about oversight, that's precisely what I was looking at. That society has a complex system where it can check that the police, the intelligence services, the public prosecutors, the anti-corruption commissions, the anti-mafia commissions, that they don't have unfettered power, that they have power for which they are accountable, and basically that somebody can go along anytime and check them. Because unfortunately, in many countries, including many European countries, at this moment in time, the frameworks which exist are either old, antiquated, or incapable of keeping up with the very technologies that the police would like to keep up with.
So the oversight bit was important, but then, Chiara, you gave us that slide that showed how many steps you have to go through precisely to fulfill an oversight perspective. How do we, have exactly what Joe's looking for there, which I totally agree with. We need to have that backstop of protection, and yet allow efficiency to catch the bad guys.
But I don't think we have solution. We have some ways we can use to find a solution. And the main problem is that we have our investigation are under a clock alarm because we have 6 months of investigation, no more time. So we have to collaborate to obtain information in a very short time. And every time we have to remember that we have to balance all these different rights. So the right to obtain information with the right of private life and so on. This is the hardest part of our job, to balance all these different situations. For example, if I catch a refugee and he doesn't want to give his fingerprint,
yeah.
I can't force him. I can't force him.
Right.
So every time I have to balance all these different situations.
What I suggest you need to do is look at that particular law which says that you can't force him. Because actually, when you see the way that laws are set out, that's why they are not absolute. So if you give yourself a legal basis where the fingerprint or other biometric data is properly protected, then I think you can move yourself towards a position where you would find the Italian courts and the European courts of human rights saying, no, you can't take a fingerprint, right? And in fact, that is something where I think we are increasingly moving to. It's not that you can't take the fingerprint, it's what you do with it, right? And in fact, this is part of the question that we have with facial recognition, in the sense that if you take the fingerprint, you've collected the data and you've kept it. Whereas with facial recognition, very often, you're just taking a picture ephemerally, and if it doesn't match your database, you throw it away. So there's a lot to be said in either direction as to whether that kind of technology is protecting privacy most, or whether it's actually infringing on privacy.
Okay, Jennifer, you want to quickly weigh in there?
I mean, at the moment, there's a new law in EU law. It's the e-evidence, which is doing away with a lot of these extra steps that Chiara was talking about. The talks have just begun about having this e-evidence relationship with the US, which would allow a country to access cloud-stored data in another jurisdiction. And they want this because there was a case, it was in Ireland, it was commonly known as the Microsoft warrant case. A court in New York wanted access to an email that was stored, I think it was Google, I think it must have been a Gmail, in Ireland on the data service. Now, they had a method for doing it. It was an MLAT, the Multi-Legal Assistance Treaty. They should have gone to them. So the Americans asked the Irish, we have a legitimate reason we want this, and the Irish authorities go assess whether it's legal and valid in Ireland and hand the evidence over. The US court decided it didn't want to go to the trouble of asking the Irish authorities for their permission and tried to rule, sorry, it was Microsoft, why am I saying it was Google? It was obviously Microsoft, and tried to force Microsoft to hand it over because it had control of this piece of data. And I mean, that bothers me that they wanted to ride roughshod over the Irish authorities, because there are protections in laws that differ. There are different standards. The US doesn't even meet the threshold for adequacy privacy standards compared to the EU. So it's all well and good to have all this sharing if we're all in a club where we agree the human rights and protections are the same. But once you start opening the door to other countries, I mean, the US, sure, has got pretty decent rights at the moment, but I don't know what's going to happen under a next legislation. I don't know that Donald Trump's not going to suddenly be dictator for life in a few years. And under those circumstances, I don't want my EU-protected civil liberties being handed over because at one point someone thought this is just going to be easier.
Great. I want to just close out on one point that maybe the three of the remaining panelists can weigh in on, because it's the role there for what I think is this hybrid solution to this problem. And all three of you referred to it in some way about the fact, Miranda, that you were saying that regulation needs to become sort of smarter and to start using AI and things to actually move quicker. And Stefano, you were talking about the roles that can be played. And of course, John, you laid out a picture for a different way of checking facts and so forth. So how do, given the challenge that was laid out here that the law is facing in this environment, very quickly, each of you, just give us a quick view on what you think is the best thing that the technology community can do to kind of play a reg tech role and like just enhance the legal framework, if you like, and the civil liberty protections, with tech being an aider rather than a challenge to those. So anybody want to jump on it? Miranda, yes.
In my view, a good solution, one of the solutions could be to enforce and put forward the regulatory sandboxes, where in an effective and safe way regulation can be experimented. And in conjunction with this, also the involvement of the civil society. There is partially this, for instance, last week I was in a workshop on data ethics in the European Commission, and there was also a representative of consumers. And I think it is important to gather all together, all the position, the big industry, the consumer, to find a balance.
Great. Stefano, any thoughts?
I think one problem the governments have is their lack of technical expertise. So I think you can't do away with the companies. Companies or consultants, not necessarily referring to myself, I'm talking more of techie persons. So I think that is where the solution is, in a joint, in a cooperation. But I underline that I think it should be monitored by a representation from the people.
Okay.
Because otherwise the risk of window dressing is just too high.
Right. John, final words?
Yeah, so I'm nervous about this. So I always think, when I think about technology, about the invention of film. So the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century. It took, and when film was first invented, all they did was they filmed plays for many years. It took 50 years for the language of film to emerge. And I think we're always going to have, unfortunately, this lag. So I agree with the two previous points. In the short term, we need to bring the right people together. As a computer scientist myself, I can say that computer scientists aren't always the best communicators. So we could improve on that. And then in the longer term, we need to change our education system dramatically. So the strongest thing I would say on this is everyone should learn to code. If you can't code in this age, you're basically not literate. So everyone needs to learn to code and needs to understand data at that level to really have a connection to where the world is going.
Okay. I would possibly argue that everyone also needs to study humanities as well.
Yes. No.
Those two together must be done. Otherwise we get both sides. But yes, it's a good point. All right, let's leave it at that, everybody. I'm sorry we couldn't get any questions from the floor, but we really, we're running up on the fact that we all need to eat and then come back for the Young People's Summit. So thanks very much for your attention. A round of applause for the panel, everybody. Thanks.